World War II didn't just reshape geopolitics and military technology. It fundamentally transformed how goods are produced, marketed, and consumed, creating the mass consumer society that defines modern life. And this transformation wasn't a peaceful post-war development, but emerged directly from wartime mobilization. From the need to produce weapons and supplies at unprecedented scales using standardized processes and new materials, from the rationing and propaganda systems that changed how people thought about consumption and desire, from the technologies developed for military purposes that would be repurposed for consumer goods, from the full employment and rising wages that gave working people purchasing power they'd never had before, from the advertising and marketing techniques refined to sell war bonds and encourage sacrifices that would be redirected to selling refrigerators and automobiles, and from the destruction of European and Japanese productive capacity that left American industry uniquely positioned to supply global consumer demand after the war. So when the war ended in 1945, the United States had developed the industrial capacity, the marketing infrastructure, the consumer credit systems, the advertising expertise, and the pent-up demand that would combine to create the post-war consumer boom. The age of television advertising and shopping malls and planned obsolescence and consumer credit and brands that transcended products to sell lifestyles and identities. All of this emerged directly from innovations and transformations that occurred during the war, making World War II the crucible where modern consumerism was forged, where the techniques and technologies and mindsets that define how we shop and what we buy and why we want what we want were developed and tested and proven. And understanding this connection between total war and total consumerism reveals uncomfortable truths about the origins of our material abundance, about how military imperatives shaped civilian life in lasting ways, and about how the greatest catastrophe in human history paradoxically created the foundations for the greatest expansion of prosperity and material comfort in history, at least for those fortunate enough to live in the winning countries. The wartime production miracle was the first crucial element. The United States ramped up industrial production to levels that seemed impossible before the war. By 1943, American factories were producing more war material than all the Axis powers combined. This required innovations in mass production, standardization, supply chain management, and quality control. Henry Ford's assembly line techniques were applied to everything from Liberty ships to B-24 bombers. Components were standardized so they could be mass-produced and easily replaced. Production processes were simplified and dekilled so that workers with minimal training could do complex manufacturing tasks. And new materials like plastics and synthetic rubber were developed to replace scarce natural materials. And these innovations weren't discarded after the war. They were applied to consumer goods production. The same techniques that built 300,000 military aircraft during the war built millions of automobiles after it. The standardization that allowed quick assembly of tanks allowed quick assembly of washing machines and televisions. The plastics developed for military applications became consumer products. Tupperware and vinyl records and synthetic fabrics. The supply chain management developed to coordinate delivery of parts from thousands of suppliers to assembly plants was applied to consumer goods distribution, creating the efficient just-in-time systems that make modern retail possible. So the war essentially trained American industry in mass production techniques that would define post-war manufacturing and created production capacity far beyond what peacetime demand had required. Capacity that would be redirected to flooding the market with consumer goods. The transformation of women's roles during the war had lasting effects on consumer culture. Millions of women entered the workforce during the war, taking factory jobs and other positions vacated by men in the military. And while many women were pushed back out of these jobs after the war, the experience changed expectations and created new markets. Women who had earned independent incomes during the war wanted consumer goods marketed to them directly, wanted labor-saving appliances that would make domestic work easier so they could pursue other activities, wanted fashions and cosmetics and products that acknowledged their agency and purchasing power, and marketers responded by creating advertising that appealed to women as consumers and decision-makers, creating brands and products designed specifically for women's perceived needs and desires. And this represented a shift from pre-war marketing, which had largely treated women as passive or as making purchases for their husbands and families, Post-war marketing recognized women as primary consumers with their own wants and the economic power to satisfy them. And this was directly traceable to wartime changes in women's economic roles. The war had demonstrated that women could work and earn and make independent economic decisions, and consumer capitalism adapted to exploit this new market. The technology transfers from military to consumer applications were extensive and transformative. Radar technology developed during the war led to the microwave oven, invented when a Raytheon engineer noticed that radar waves melted a chocolate bar in his pocket. Jet engine technology led to commercial aviation, making air travel accessible to middle-class consumers rather than just the wealthy. Computer technology developed for military calculations became the foundation for business. Computers, and eventually personal computers, synthetic materials developed for parachutes and tents became consumer fabrics. Insecticides developed to protect soldiers from disease-carrying insects became consumer pesticides. Advances in food preservation and packaging to supply troops became the basis for processed foods, and the supermarket revolution, frozen foods, canned goods, preserves, all these expanded dramatically using techniques developed or refined during the war, and medical. Technologies like penicillin and blood banks and advanced surgical techniques developed to treat wounded soldiers became available to civilians, improving health outcomes and changing expectations about medical care. So the war accelerated technological development across multiple domains, and the post-war period saw these military technologies repurposed for civilian consumption, creating new products and entirely new industries that transformed daily life. The credit revolution that enabled post-war consumerism had wartime origins. During the war, the government ran massive deficits, borrowing unprecedented amounts to finance military spending. And this normalized deficit spending in ways that hadn't been acceptable before, and the war bonds sold to ordinary citizens. Millions of Americans bought bonds as patriotic duty, normalized the idea of using credit instruments, of saving and investing through financial products rather than just keeping money in the bank or under the mattress. And after the war, consumer credit expanded dramatically, using financial techniques and infrastructure developed during wartime. Installment plans that had existed before the war became ubiquitous. Credit cards were invented in the late 1940s and spread through the 1950s, allowing consumers to buy goods they couldn't afford with cash. Mortgages became widely available through government programs like the GI Bill and FHA insurance, allowing millions to buy homes they couldn't have afforded otherwise. And this explosion of consumer credit was essential to the consumer boom, because it allowed people to consume beyond their current incomes, to buy cars and appliances and homes by committing future income. And the psychological shift from seeing debt as shameful to seeing credit as normal and even desirable. This was partly driven by wartime normalization of government borrowing and bond purchases, and by the post-war prosperity that made people confident they could repay debts, that their incomes would continue rising, making borrowing rational rather than risky. The advertising industry was revolutionized by wartime propaganda. The government had recruited advertising agencies to sell war bonds, to encourage rationing and sacrifices, to promote military recruitment, and the techniques developed for these campaigns, emotional appeals, aspirational imagery, celebrity endorsements, sophisticated use of media, these were applied to selling consumer goods after the war. And advertisers who had sold the war effort now sold automobiles and appliances and lifestyles, using the same psychological techniques, linking products to patriotism or status or modernity or happiness, creating associations between brands and desirable identities. And television, which became mass medium in the 1950s, was the perfect vehicle for this advertising, combining visual and audio elements in ways that radio and print couldn't match. And television advertising, which became the dominant form of marketing, was essentially applying wartime propaganda techniques to commercial purposes, the hard sell, the emotional manipulation, the creation of artificial desires. All of this was refined during the war and then directed towards selling consumer goods. And the result was advertising that was far more sophisticated and effective than pre-war advertising had been, capable of creating mass markets for products people hadn't known they wanted, convincing millions that they needed products that hadn't existed or had been luxuries, making consumption central to identity and status in ways that hadn't been true before. The concept of planned obsolescence, designing products to wear out or become obsolete so consumers will replace them, was developed in the 1920s and 30s but became dominant after the war, and this was partly because wartime production had created so much industrial capacity that peacetime demand couldn't absorb it if products were durable. If people bought appliances or cars that lasted decades, the factories that had built them would have no repeat customers, would face overcapacity and unemployment. So planned obsolescence was a solution to the problem of excessive production capacity. Design products to fail or to seem outdated within a few years, encouraging replacement purchases. And this was implemented through annual model changes in automobiles, through fashion cycles in clothing, through technological upgrades in electronics, always creating reasons for consumers to replace functioning products with newer models. And this represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between producers and consumers, from making durable goods that served customers for years to making disposable goods that needed constant replacement. And this shift was necessary to sustain the production levels that wartime mobilization had created. Peacetime demand wasn't sufficient unless consumers could be convinced to buy repeatedly, to never be satisfied, to always want the latest model. And this required the sophisticated marketing developed during the war, the ability to convince people that last year's car or dress or appliance was obsolete even though it still worked. And this cycle of desire and replacement and disposal became central to post-war consumer culture, defining modern consumption patterns. The suburban expansion that defined post-war America was enabled by wartime transformations. The construction techniques and materials developed to build military bases and housing for defense workers were applied to building suburbs. Mass-produced standardized houses using prefabricated components, Levittown being the famous example. Entire neighborhoods built quickly using assembly line techniques. And the automobile-centric lifestyle of suburbs required the mass production of cars, which was possible because of wartime advances in manufacturing, and the highway system that made suburbs accessible was partly justified by defense needs. The interstate highway system was officially the national system of interstate and defense highways, designed to move military vehicles and evacuate cities in case of nuclear attack, but primarily used for civilian commuting and commerce. And the suburban lifestyle created demand for consumer goods. Houses needed to be furnished, required appliances, and televisions and lawnmowers and all the products of consumer culture. And the isolation of suburban life, the separation from extended family and traditional communities, made consumption more important as source of identity and status. You signaled your success through your possessions, your car and appliances and house, in ways that hadn't been necessary in traditional communities where status was based on family and personal relationships. So suburbanization, which was enabled by wartime innovations and shaped by Cold War defense policies, created the social conditions that made mass consumerism central to American life. The global dimension was crucial. World War II destroyed European and Japanese industrial capacity. Factories were bombed, infrastructure was destroyed, economies were devastated, and this left the United States as the only major industrial power with intact production capacity. And American companies eagerly filled the void, exported consumer goods globally, established brands and distribution networks internationally, and created the template for global consumer culture. American products, American brands, American styles. These became global standards, partly through Marshall Plan aid, which was often tied to purchasing American goods, partly through American military presence, which exposed people worldwide to American products, partly through American media, Hollywood films, and later television showing American lifestyles and consumer goods, creating demand for these products globally. And American companies built factories abroad, licensed products, established franchises, spreading American consumer culture worldwide. And this global expansion was possible because the war had destroyed competitors and because American production techniques and marketing methods were more advanced, refined through wartime mobilization. So American consumer culture became global consumer culture. McDonald's and Coca-Cola and blue jeans and Hollywood and rock music, all spreading worldwide in the decades after the war, creating the globalized consumer culture we inhabit today. And this was a direct result of how the war positioned America uniquely to supply global demand and to project its cultural products globally. The Cold War extended and intensified consumerism by making it ideological. The competition with the Soviet Union wasn't just military. It was a contest between capitalism and communism, between consumer abundance and egalitarian scarcity, and American leaders explicitly promoted consumerism as evidence of capitalism's superiority. The famous kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev in 1959 was about household appliances, about whether American consumerism or Soviet industrial development better served people, and the American argument was that capitalism produced consumer abundance that improved ordinary people's lives in ways that Soviet communism couldn't match. And this made consumerism patriotic. Buying goods wasn't just satisfying personal desires. It was participating in the American way of life, was demonstrating the superiority of the American system. And this ideological dimension intensified consumption, made it about more than personal satisfaction, made it about national identity and political commitment. And this legacy persists. Consumerism remains tied to American national identity in ways that might seem strange without understanding the Cold War context. The idea that shopping is patriotic, that consuming is participating in the economy and society, that material abundance is the measure of success. These all come from the Cold War framing of consumerism as ideological statement, as way of life that defined America in opposition to communism. The environmental costs of this consumer culture weren't recognized initially. The extraction of resources, the pollution from manufacturing, the waste from disposal of obsolete products. These were largely ignored in the post-war boom. Growth and consumption were unquestioned goods, and only later, in the 1960s and 70s, did environmental movements begin pointing out the costs. The degradation of land and water and air, the unsustainability of endless growth on a finite planet. And we're still grappling with these costs. Climate change and pollution and resource depletion are all consequences of the mass consumer culture created after World War II. And addressing these problems requires rethinking the consumption patterns established then, requires moving away from the planned obsolescence and disposability and constant upgrading that define modern consumerism. Requires questioning whether the material abundance created through wartime innovations and post-war expansion is sustainable or desirable, and whether the consumerism invented by World War II is a trap we need to escape rather than an achievement to celebrate. And these are difficult questions because consumerism is so deeply embedded in modern identity and economy, because so many people's livelihoods depend on continued consumption, because the entire economic system is built on assumptions of constant growth and increasing consumption that originated in the wartime and post-war transformations. The psychological impact of transforming people into consumers rather than citizens or workers or community members has been profound. Pre-war identity was largely based on work and family and community. You were a farmer or a shopkeeper or a factory worker. You were a member of a church and a neighborhood and an extended family, and these identities were relatively stable. But post-war consumer culture created more fluid identities based on consumption. You were what you bought, your car and your clothes and your appliances signaled who you were and who you aspired to be. And this was liberating in some ways, allowed people to construct identities rather than inheriting them, allowed mobility and change, but it was also alienating, made people dependent on continued consumption to maintain identity, made satisfaction temporary, always requiring more purchases to maintain status or sense of self, and created the hamster wheel of work to earn money to buy things that you hope will make you happy but that only create desire for more things. And this psychology, where consumption is never satisfying, where there's always a newer model or better product or higher status good to desire. This is the legacy of the wartime and post-war transformation, the creation of the unsatisfied consumer as the basic unit of modern economy and society. And whether this is progress or pathology remains contested. World War II invented modern consumerism by creating the production capacity, the marketing techniques, the credit systems, the technological foundations, and the social conditions that made mass consumption possible and central to economic and social life. And this wasn't intentional, wasn't planned, was an emergent consequence of mobilizing for total war and then redirecting that mobilization to peacetime purposes. The innovations developed to fight the war were applied to selling consumer goods, The production techniques designed for weapons were used for appliances. The propaganda methods used to motivate sacrifice were used to encourage consumption. The credit systems developed to finance government borrowing were applied to consumer purchases. And the result was a transformation of daily life at least as significant as the geopolitical transformations the war caused. More people's lives were changed more profoundly by the refrigerator and the television and the automobile than by the United Nations or NATO or the Cold War. And these consumer goods and the culture around them were direct products of the war. Couldn't have emerged when they did or how they did without the wartime transformations. So the greatest catastrophe in human history, the war that killed perhaps 70 million people, also created the material abundance and consumer culture that defines modern life for billions. And this paradox, that unprecedented destruction enabled unprecedented prosperity. That total war created total consumerism, remains one of the most significant and underappreciated legacies of World War II. A legacy we live with every day in every purchase we make, in every advertisement we see, and every product we desire. All of it traceable back to innovations and transformations that occurred during 6 years of total war, making modern consumerism inseparable from its violent origins, and raising questions about whether the prosperity built on wartime foundations is sustainable or desirable, whether the consumer culture invented by World War II serves us or entraps us, and whether we can imagine and create alternative ways of living that don't depend on the endless consumption and planned obsolescence and advertising manipulation that emerged from history's greatest catastrophe to become the defining features of modern life.